Um, Somebody challenged me to put down in memories what my memories are of my grandmother. They actually suggested I should write about her. Um, and I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I really think it's actually a special thing to try to record some of the memories that I have about my grandmother, who was a very special person for me. I think that older people in Western society are sometimes forgotten, um, and I think that's very sad in a way because, from my own experience, I can say that I really treasured the time with my grandmother Jean before she died. Um, every occasion, every moment, time spent with Gran was fantastic. It may sound sentimental. I guess most people are fond of their grandparents, but um, I'd like to just try and remember some of the things that made her a special human being. So my grandmother Jean Roberts Ogden, as she was born in Harrogate in the late 1920s. Unfortunately, I don't have the exact date to hand, but she was born in Harrogate. Her father was a wealthy uh, jeweler and diamond and trader, um, with jewelers in London, in York, and in Harrogate. The shop is still there, William Ogden's in Harrogate, and has been there since, well, I guess since it was started, which I guess was the early 1900s. Um, Gran always told us about how she had lived in some style growing up, and I don't think any of us really believed it as children. And it was only really when I visited Harrogate myself about some 5 or so years ago that I actually saw the beautiful old Victorian shop near Betty's Tea Room, the famous Betty's Tea Room in Harrogate High Street. Um, and it was really a beautiful thing to see that my great grandfather, my grandmother's dad, was really a great man, a highly respected man in Harrogate, somebody who was really appreciated and valued. Granny always said that he had been the mayor of Harrogate, which, well, that's quite an honour, I guess, and that he had been freeman. And it was only really going there that I actually realised that everything Grant had always said was true. And they did live in a beautiful street, and she had a brother and a sister, and her brother was called Richard Ogden, who is also a very fine person, and perhaps I'll be able to take a moment to say a few words about Richard. And yeah, I mean, maybe I could say a few words about Richard. So Richard took over the family business, and he opened the jewellers in Burlington Arcade in Mayfair, just off Piccadilly, which is still there, which is run by my cousin Robert. He went into the army after Harrow School, which is a very good English school, and he was awarded an MBE for his work in the military intelligence, which is basically the army's intelligence corps. So he's a bit of a James Bond character. He became a major in the military intelligence, so quite a high position. And then he served in Asia, fighting against the Japanese in World War II, and indeed was reputed to have captured several spies, and hence he was awarded such a great honour, member of the British Empire. Richard was a very fine man, a man of great humour, a man of great taste, a spiritual person, a very extraordinary human being, someone who just begged to be respected just by his manner and his way. He was just a very sort of calming and sophisticated gentleman. He lived in Coleherne Court in Kensington, and he had a 3-bedroom flat there with a beautiful view over the gardens, and he would take the bus every day down to Piccadilly, and then he would work at his jeweller's shop in Burlington Arcade, and at lunchtimes he would sit in the park. And then when he had time, he would, in the park where he rented his deck chair in the summertime, and he would read the newspaper and have his sandwich, a very modest person. He lived in the country the rest of the time, near Deal in Kent. He had 2 wives, one of which was Indonesian, which in those days, as we're talking about the 1950s, was quite a remarkable thing to do. And he had 3 children. And then he would always spend his holidays in Italy, on a beautiful island just off the coast. I believe it was off the coast of Tuscany, which unfortunately I've never managed to visit, but it was basically a monastery, and he would always spend time there with the monks. And Richard was interested in yoga and Indian spirituality, a character trait which indeed remains in this part of the family, in my part of the family, not only my mother, but also myself and others in my family. Yeah, Richard was a man of distinction, somebody that you always learned from. I treasure the times when I met him as a child growing up, and I'm very grateful to have known such a distinguished person as a family member. Someone who was always well dressed and well spoken and very kind and calm and intelligent. I was very grateful to have the opportunity to buy an apartment for Granny when my step-grandfather Francis died, and that was Richard really who initiated that. So, it was a wonderful opportunity to help my grandmother at the time, but it was just the sort of man that Richard was. Granny had another sibling, which was Lorna, and again, much like either of them really, I can't really speak highly enough about Lorna. It's actually wonderful to think that I come from that same family, because they're really wonderful human beings, and I was very privileged to know them. Lorna was a very, very, very fine lady indeed. Lorna was the elder sister, Granny was the youngest sister, Jean, and Lorna was a wise person, a very intuitive person, a very kind person who always kept dogs and cats, who was very careful with her money, who knew well how to plan things ahead, who looked after other people, who was always concerned and considerate, who could cook, who kept a beautiful home in South Kensington in Brecon Place. She played bridge. She belonged to the Hurlingham Club in London, which is a social club. She was very, very popular. She had lots and lots of friends. She married a man who was a property developer, called Ferdinando, and he was a property developer in Chelsea. And after the war, which was a time when obviously it was not that easy really to become a property developer, but because, well, I guess that not that many people had money, frankly. Um, but anyway, Lorna had several children. She had 4 children, and she she always spoke with great pride of her children and her grandchildren. And she was a remarkable person because, like me, she also loved football. And in the 1970s, when her children were growing up, late 60s, she had a season ticket at Chelsea, Stamford Bridge, which was pretty unusual for somebody as, well, dignified, I guess is the best way of describing her. But she had the season ticket in order to take her children to watch Chelsea, her boys, which I think is a very rational thing to do. I think it's hard to describe what kind of person Lorna was, but she left, when she died, she left a big hole in my life, certainly. She was a woman of distinction, someone of great wisdom and kindness, and a very peaceful person, and witty and fun. So I don't know what I can really say. I mean, she lived in Bolton Gardens in London, which is a lovely place to live, and she also lived in the countryside in Norfolk. Yeah, I guess really that's kind of covered Lorna. So that's Lorna, and that was Richard, the siblings of my grandmother Jean. My grandmother, who I really want to talk about, was above all a kind person, a kind and gentle person, quiet and unassuming. My Jean could do many things which I really can't see many people in today's generation being able to do. She was able to do things like paint watercolors, do pottery. She could write poetry. She could do the Times crossword, which she used to do with my grandfather almost every other day. Gran always kept a beautiful home. She, dinner was always served to perfection with the table properly laid. The house was always immaculate. Gran kept to her routines, and she did an awful lot of charity work, mostly with Sue Ryder Foundation, which is a foundation for the elderly, and later on in life with various cancer charities. Gran, much like Lorna, both played tennis. Lorna played until she was 80. My grandmother played until she was about 70, and it was remarkable that these guys just kept going like that. I mean, Granny would go swimming until she was about 70 in the sea, and Lorna likewise, and Richard likewise. They were very active people. And I think the reason why I wanted to just make this brief video was, I suppose perhaps if somebody else who knew them maybe stumbles across it, or perhaps people know of them, or perhaps it's just really to share, to keep this video, to remember these people, Richard Ogden, Jean Roberts Ogden, who later became Jean McFadden, and then after that, her last husband, she became Jean Coleridge. something she was very proud of because she loved literature. And her husband, Francis Coleridge, my step-grandfather, he was of the Coleridge family, of the famous writers, English writers, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And as I mentioned before, Lorna, who was Lorna Ogden, who became Lorna Ferdinando, then became Lorna Carey. Again, she also married twice. Her second husband was Richard Carey, who was a theatre director at RADA, Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. I don't think one could take anything like that for granted. The fact that my grandmother studied at the Guildhall University in Speech Therapy, the fact that she was a Wren in the Second World War, in the women's. She was an officer in the Women's Royal Navy, as was her sister Lorna, and that Granny gave up probably something like 7 years of her youth, or 6 or 7 years in World War II. That Gran lost the hearing in one ear when she was in Portsmouth when a bomb fell on her house, or that another bomb fell on their family home in St James's, where they lived. That Gran was a debutante, and that her wedding was at that church just off the King's Road. I think it's called St Luke's. And her wedding reception was at Café Royal, which is still there in Piccadilly. Oh, no, it was at Quaglino's actually. Café Royal was a debutante's dance that she told me about. Gran was a church-going person, much like myself, and she was always very proud right until the end that she would read the lesson, and she was honorary church warden of the Anglican church in Mallorca, where she lived her last years. I guess the main memory I have is just always of someone who's incredibly kind, distinguished, modest to a fault, and incredibly able. You know, that generation, people like Lorna and Jean, they were very distinguished English people. They were people who were modest, and they could do everything. They could cook, they could keep a household, they could organize fundraising for charities, they could drive, they could swim, they could play tennis, they could do crosswords, they could paint watercolors, as I mentioned before. But all of these things were just taken in their stride. There was nothing that they would sort of feel desperately proud about. And Gran was above all a really wonderful listener. She would just sort of sit with you and listen, and you could tell her about what was going on in your life. Gran would listen. She could listen for half an hour or even longer. And you never felt judged by her. It always felt like she fully accepted you, whatever you were saying. And she was always kind and thoughtful, which I think is a character trait of many grandparents, but she was kind and thoughtful in that, you know, if the summer holidays came while I was at university, she would always make sure I had some money, or she'd always make sure that I had a good meal when I came to her house, and kind of nice things like that, just really nice things, nice and thoughtful things. Or she always sent a birthday card, always sent a nice present. And I spent a lot of time in her house, and it was always a lovely house, whether it was in Shropshire or Worcestershire or Mallorca. It was always just a lovely house. It was always a beautiful old English house. Even the house in Mallorca looked like an English house, the way it was decorated, you know, with antiques and old oiled paintings and lots of English books and things. I suppose that's really just about all I want to say. I just really wanted to do this video to remember a magnificent generation of people who I was lucky to call my great uncle Richard, my great aunt Lorna, and my grandmother Jean. People I learned a lot from, and I would like to think that in some tiny way they've influenced my character. There are many memories, like Gran teaching me to read as a child, or taking me to tennis lessons or swimming lessons as a child, or baking cakes or things like that, which stick out. But above all, it was just her kindness. It's not easy being a parent, and I didn't always get on with my parents, particularly my mother. And Gran was always there when my mother wasn't there. Not that I blame my mother, but I just valued having my Gran there. And she was always somebody who you could just phone up, and she'd always understand what was going on. And it was just really nice having someone like that around. Someone just to write a card to, or you just sort of get random postcards here and there, or you'd get a phone call here and there. Here and there, in fact, it was much more regular than that. It was probably every 2 weeks or so I'd hear from my grandmother, and it was just enormously appreciated. I don't think there's very much else I want to add at this point, except that I felt I wanted to make this small tribute to Jean, and I guess I would encourage other people to spend time with their grandparents while they're still alive, and listen to some of the stories that they have to say, that they have to tell, and try to learn something from their wisdom and their dedication. Grandparents are not around forever, and when they're gone, one realizes how special they really were. And I would just encourage other people to not allow the older people in their life to be lonely, but rather to benefit from what the older people have to say, and perhaps, like me, be inspired by their dignity and their wisdom, their courage, and their wonderful, extraordinary stories. Great, great generation of English people who did so much for us in World War II. So, yeah, that's about it, really. So, thank you, Gran, for who you were. And I hope that other people seeing this choose to reach out to their grandparents.